by what the code's producing, then the council is requesting you to be proactive and request your staff, planning staff, to work with you to correct those deficiencies. Come up with recommendations that you can review and move forward to the council to fix those issues. Second part of this is the municipal council strives to establish well-articulated outcome policies for the city and its neighborhoods in the form of Vision 2030, the general plan, neighborhood plans, and other city policy documents in order to provide unambiguous and adequate direction to land use applicants and the city staff regarding acceptable land use applications. In other words, we need a council's committee here to be more articulate about what they would like to see happen as far as the policy, and so that one, the planning commission, the staff can have a better idea of what it is the council would like to see happen, but also that developers and other applicants would also have that type of predictability. They understand what they're getting into and what's required and what's wanted. Potential incongruencies between these policies and city ordinances. So when general plan and neighborhood plans are not in alignment with what the ordinances are producing, so then they ought to be identified, and possible action in the interest of modifying the policies or ordinances are both in order to better inform land use applicants and the staff. So that, in addition to this policy of annually talking with the planning commission, is really the impetus for this meeting. And I think at this point, I refer back to the chair. The opportunity is to have an informal dialogue about how can we improve that process. What are some of the issues you're seeing as planning commissioners? How can the council be more supportive of you, and vice versa?
Thank you, Matt. And maybe as we do that, as we look for possible ways to improve, to enhance the process, we could refer first to any sources of concern or frustration that have manifest themselves through these processes. Do commission members or council members have specific examples of concern similar to what Matt has talked about as we work through the process? Kind of help illustrate what we're talking about.
Barry, if I might.
Yes, Hal, please.
For me, this is a historic occasion. It's something that I hoped for across a period of years. To see it finally happening, I think is a healthy step for the city. As I familiarized myself with the duties of the municipal councilor and became somewhat practiced in those, I found myself frequently, I won't say frustrated, let me say it was a combination of confusion and consternation when the municipal council received recommendations from the planning commission that seemed to me to fly in the face of good sense, as well as occasionally contradicting what I consider to be policy, the code policy and the affiliated policy of the city. One of the issues in particular had to do with agreements that were often affixed to decisions recommended by the Planning Commission and that figured prominently in the history of prior decisions. These development agreements, as they were and are still known, seem to me often, again, contradictory, peculiar. There were invariably things about them that I personally found objectionable. And on one occasion, in a council work session, our legal counsel, Brian Jones, and I regret that he's not here today, set the matter straight. And in no uncertain terms, let us know that development agreements are, in fact, ultimately illegal. And they constitute a form of coercion that puts the developer at a disadvantage and may not necessarily work to the best interest of the city in the long term. It was quite forthright in condemning our dependence on development agreements. And yet it seemed to me that development agreements were standard operation for the Planning Commission. At that point, I thought somewhat more about the dilemma and recognized that the Planning Commission is appointed, first of all, by the administration, works closely with the administration, is designed to be a citizen review board, in a sense, for the administration. And so it's easy to understand how the Planning Commission would, in essence, be heavily influenced by the administration. At the same time, I became aware that development agreements were an anathema, thanks to Mr. Jones. It seemed to me that there might be some utility in the Planning Commission and the Municipal Council coming together to better understand the concept and function of development agreements, but well beyond that, to have a common understanding about the integral importance of the Planning Commission in the work of the Municipal Council. The bodies, by and large, legislatively, as Matt said, and historically, have had little to do with one another. And that may be a healthy practice to observe and preserve an independent working relationship. But I don't know that augurs well for the future of the city. And so I very much appreciate this chance to come together to express ourselves in a frank way about possible misgivings about the other entity, but more importantly, how it is we can draw from the considerable expertise and other resources of the administration to facilitate what is one of two constitutional obligations of the municipal council, and that is the use of property within the confines of Provo. So I will thank you for your indulgence in allowing that personal statement.
Hal, can I ask a
somehow
question?
casts a bit of a framework for why we're here.
Did Brian say he felt that development agreements were illegal? Is that what you?
Indeed, he did.
And illegal?
Ultimately illegal. I mean, we seem to be getting by just fine.
Yeah,
But were they tested, then he was quite confident they would be shown to be illegal.
and I appreciate hearing that. So that's something that's really concerned me also. Is having a developer having come in, well, not exactly knowing what he can and can't do.
I think if I could provide some clarity on that point.
That would be helpful.
My recollection of the discussion was not per se that they were illegal, but that per se that they had not been tested, and how we applied them is not how they are commonly applied in other governments or other situations. Now, how we apply them has not been tested. I think that's the distinction that I would make on that point. Gary has a.
And Brian may be able to join us shortly. He's on a call with UTA right now in preparation for our next meeting. Gary?
Development agreements are in and of themselves legal, and state law specifically provides for development agreements. What Provo City has done is something that's a little different than what development agreements have been mostly used for around the state and outside of the state. Development agreements in Provo have often been relegated to determining what the pitch of a roof slope would be on a house, would come in and deal with things where the base ordinance allows an occupancy rate of 3 singles, or a family. A development agreement would come in and say, well, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do 2 unrelated people. And I think it's in those areas that Brian had concerned where often we're using development agreements, frankly, as a way to deal with issues that we don't want to go through the long policy legislative process of determining. I remember on the west side, early on when some development agreements were being done, someone would come in with a subdivision and we would have development agreement delimiting the size, square footage of homes. And so we sat down with the council and planning commission and said, well, if our home sizes, the base home size that we have in the ordinance is not what the mix you're trying to get or big enough or whatever it is, let's go back and go through the process and figure out what we want to have and just put it in code. And then we don't have to, on an ad hoc basis, negotiate these development agreements every time. And we came back and proposed an ordinance, and frankly, my perception of it was that politically it just got too messy and too hard and cumbersome to deal with. And so we didn't, so we went right back to dealing with things on an ad hoc basis like that. Most communities take development agreements and deal with long-term infrastructure type issues and things like that, not the color of a house or the pitch of a roof on a house or things like that.
Or materials.
Or
Construction
materials to be used.
Yeah.
So
Jake, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Gary, along those lines, recently we've had some disappointments, I guess you could say, with the quality of certain projects because of the materials that were used. And so what would be your suggestion then if a development agreement is not an avenue to require a higher quality, project, because what we thought we were going to get and what we actually got were very different, I think, and as far as the quality and the materials that were used. And so how would you suggest working that so that you actually get what was said, what was agreed upon, and that the quality is there?
And this happens constantly. Every developer comes in and says, and brings you a pretty picture and says, I'm going to build this. And then we rezone the property, and the underlying requirements of the zone are actually here.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody thinks they're going to get this here, but they have a legal right now to build down here. And if building down here, the bare minimum, base minimum of the ordinance or the zone in which they're in is not good enough, then I would suggest we go through the policy process, what our minimum standards should be in our community. So, for instance, in an R110 zone, you can build a 1,200 square foot home, slab on grade, just very small home. That's the legal minimum that the code allows. If we don't like what homes that small coming into our community, then we ought to go through the process of changing and determining under what circumstances do we want different house sizes, what type of mix do we want, as opposed to negotiating those development agreement on an ad hoc basis, because then it becomes somewhat difficult. One developer comes in and we say, well, we don't like the materials you use. We want a higher grade of materials. We want hardy board. We want this and that. And then another developer comes in and we say, well, vinyl siding's okay here. And on what basis are we doing that? The underlying policy in the city, do we want vinyl? What kind of quality and finishes do we want in what areas? We ought to have that policy decision, put it in an ordinance, and then everybody can play by the same rules.
So maybe we could label what luxury apartments or whatever are going to look like, what a market rate is going to look like, or maybe, I don't know, whatever the name is, but maybe these types of materials fit this description, or this description fits this label, right? And maybe we make those more clear so that when people say we're going to build this, then we all know what this is, and they can't go back down to this, and that's within that same zone. Is that what you're saying?
Well, kind of. When a developer comes in and tells you, oh, I'm going to build this project and it's going to be this and this and this, don't believe them. Basically, look at the bare minimums of the zone, what it allows. That's your worst case scenario. So if a developer comes in and I'm going to have this high-end luxury development and huge windows and granite countertops and Brazilian heartwood cabinets and all of these things and Carrara marble floor and tiling, they can promise that, but if the ordinance allows laminate countertops, paper cabinets, that's your worst case scenario because they can build that. So where the disconnect comes in is a developer will come in and often with good intent to build this, then they get in the middle of the project and they have to value engineer it down and they go and they will pull out the code book and what's the bare minimum by law I have to do, then sometimes they'll go down and do that. And so if we don't like what the bare minimum project our ordinance gives us, then what I would say is why don't we change the ordinance rather than negotiate each project on an ad hoc basis? Because now we're making broad policy decisions that apply to everybody as opposed to individual development agreements that may, people can make a claim you're treating me differently for inappropriate reasons.
Gary, Ms. Jensen.
Yes, and Jamin did as well. Jamin, do you still have a comment?
I do.
Deborah, go ahead, and then Jamin.
I was just going to add to what Gary has said. I mean, he has a very talented planning department from what I've seen, and they've done an excellent job. But to rely on development agreements is opening yourself up for perception of ad hoc decisions, and it's very difficult to execute that consistently. The communities I've worked in over the years primarily depend on things like design guidelines, and they can be established by district. So you could have one set for your downtown core, another set for any historic character neighborhoods. And really what you do is outline, and in addition to your normal building codes, you outline things like materials, how much transparency in the downtown for retail uses and other uses on the ground floor, cornice heights, roof pitches, all of those things, even streetscaping, can all be laid out in the design guidelines so that when a developer is interested in a property in a certain area or district, they know up front, yes, here are the building codes we have to adhere to, but here are also the overlay design guidelines or codes that we have to adhere to for this district. It's very effective. It has to be codified, you know, it has to be incorporated into your codes, and it gives the development community a level of certainty so that they know that they're not going to be able to come into the city center, for example, and build something that doesn't meet those quality criteria that you've established as a community. So I would agree that it's a wise direction to take.
Right now, our ordinance is really this. When you look at the zone requirements, you can do an incredibly broad spectrum of it. And what this is tightens it up and gives more predictability and direction. Now, having said that, it's harder to do because we have to go to planning commission, we have to have public hearings. With the home size example, the Home Builders Association came out in force and said, you can't do this, and lobby and bang the table and things like that. So we said, okay. The irony was, through development agreements, we're requiring bigger home sizes than what we had suggested changing the ordinance to, but the home builders weren't complaining about the individual development agreements.
Gary, can I just comment on the predictability aspect? I think it's really key. In my experience, it's a predictability factor, not just for the developer, but for the neighborhoods on both parts. One, you're able to articulate in very clear terms, and usually, you know, that's one way form-based coding is very valuable. It can be very graphical. If you, in graphics, you know, picture speaks 1,000 words. It's very easy to understand when you have, as you stated, it may have suggested visual graphics and those design guidelines that articulate the actual outcomes you want, or a range of outcomes. That's helpful for the neighborhood. And You as a planner can sit down with neighborhood chairs and other citizens and say, very easily, this is the range of what we allow. It's also very helpful for the development community. You know, often Provo gets a bad rap. We get a bad rap for being difficult. And there's multiple reasons, multiple assertions for that rap. But part of it is unpredictability. You know, my experience, a lot of the development community is hesitant or wary or have heard stories that make them wary because that predictability factor is not there. So it's a two-way street on the predictability.
Jamin.
So I would just echo what Gary and Deborah have both said, and that it seems to me that development agreements are outcomes of a code that was largely written in the 1970s or 80s, and us wanting to do something very different now that the code just doesn't require. So the area where I've felt that most frustrating is in terms of setback requirements. I've found that really challenging. Take, for example, the intersection of University Parkway and 900 East, where the MTC, Laundry, and Health Center are. Those are three radically different situated buildings. The Health Center is very far back from the street. The new laundry facility is closer, but not as ideal as I would have liked it. And the MTC is, I think, beautifully situated right up on the corner to create a very walkable space. But those were just, it was random. It was arbitrary that the MTC decided to build. I mean, I think they received encouragement from the city planners, but nothing in the code required them to do that, even though that was the desirable outcome, in my mind, in terms of creating a more walkable, livable space. And I felt that over and over again. If you take, for example, I wasn't on the commission, and I don't know if it even went through the commission, the CVS building, but now Bulldog is going to become a very walkable, bike-friendly space, and yet now we have all these buildings that are, situated really far back, and CVS is on a prime corner. Why could we not have required them to situate themselves up on the street, have the parking behind, especially now in light of this? So to me, that's been really frustrating, and would be one of the things that I would love to, ask as a city planning commissioner that the staff and others that we start rethinking some of the setback requirements. And then parking is the other thing that comes up over and over again. The amount of required parking. I think more recently with Startup Crossing was an example where it's worked well. That was part of a new zone that we had passed. It required less parking, but right now our parking outside of those special zones doesn't have any flexibility in terms of what it requires of who. And I know that we're in the process of trying to revise and re-envision our kind of master parking plan, which will be great. But those are the things that over and over again come up for me. So setback, kind of where you site things, and then parking needs to be addressed.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So when you talk about setbacks, are you thinking that it's better to have the building positioned pretty much on the sidewalk in urban areas or suburban, both suburban and urban? As I just recently, actually Sunday, had someone come to me and say, why did they build that apartment on 700 North and 9th East so close to the sidewalk?
Yeah.
It's right there. You can hardly even see when you're turning. And I said, well, it's more of an urban look and feel it's supposed to create walkability, but they're like, but you can't see around, and their feeling is that's more moving into suburban area, and why, obviously it's BYU and it's all, high rises there, but moving into more of a neighborhood area. So what's your thought on
so
that?
for me, the frustration, so part of the frustration is from a citizen's perspective is going to be, we're transitioning from one kind of city to a different kind of city. And so I think there'll inevitably be those transitions. But for me, the frustrations have come when a building goes in an urban area. I think of around BYU campus as we want to promote walkability. We want to make things more pleasant, more convenient for walkers and cyclists, and perhaps worry less about the convenience of cars than we have in the past. Whereas in other places, I'm not as bothered. But our code right now doesn't allow us to distinguish. Okay, in this place, we really want that MTC right up on that sidewalk. It will create a much more pleasant walking environment. Whereas when you walk past the health center, to me, that's not interesting. It doesn't promote walking. There's a huge parking lot there saying, come park here. Don't walk here, come park here. So yeah, in those kinds of places, I think we want, and again, I think we're in a transition of figuring out, okay, what do we want those places to be? So the Walking Neighborhood Plan has recently said, we want that space, those blocks, directly south of campus up into 700, 500 North. We want those to be much denser, and so we want to have the zoning codes that require buildings to be. I'm so upset about the new bank that's on that corner where it used to be a gas station on 820.
And 700.
What is it?
700.
Yeah. So they did a beautiful thing in bringing that corner out. It used to be treacherous to have to cross that corner. So I love that they extended the sidewalk, but there's a drive-up bank there. Why? That was, to me, that's such a blown opportunity. And again, I don't know if codes I'm not sure the history of that property, but that needed to be a high-density, mixed-use building right there. And it's a drive-up bank. So there's moments like that where I feel like our codes just need to catch up to what we want to do and what the vision of the Walking Neighborhood Plan outlined for that. The drive-up bank was not part of the vision of that neighborhood plan.
And I think it may make more sense when the transportation system is a little more favorable for those who are walking and biking too, because I think that the vision, I think people will understand a little bit better.
Yeah.
Because right now we have complaints from BYU students saying, I can't park, I don't know where to park. And we're saying, well, the movement is to have less cars, leave your cars there, but then I can't get anywhere because we still need our cars. And we still go to Moab on the weekend and we still do these things. We still need our cars to get around Provo even. So I think it'll make more sense once transportation options catch up as well with the density that's.
But we need to start reforming our codes to allow right now, so that when we build a CVS or whatever, that we make sure that it's with that future vision in mind.
And I think that's part of the problem is that so many of us, I've lived here 60 years now, almost, and we all have the vision of what we know and love. And we're sometimes less flexible about predicting what we want, what can happen in the future, because we love what's happened in the past so much. And that becomes a real challenge if we're going to allow the city to evolve. And that's where we got to figure out our plans so we know what we want.
So relative to development agreements, what I think we're hearing is to the extent that they can be made, any issues that we have relative to development can be made permanent parts of our code, and to minimize, as some mentioned, development agreements haven't been tested, and so to the extent we can refine our codes to include any concerns we have would be a preferred outcome. Brian, any comments you would make? You're kind of catching us here at the tail end of this discussion on development agreements.
Well, we had our joint meeting it's been 2 years now that we had the meeting where we talked quite extensively about development agreements. And, so I think the comments that have been made are very appropriate and very well taken. And the issue is not so much that development agreements are inappropriate, but they've been, as we mentioned before, they've been used in Provo in ways that they haven't been used elsewhere, right? I mean, the typical, if you go read a book about development agreements began when the zoning actually, and are usually used in places where the zoning is already in place, right? A developer comes in and they've got a 3-phase development, and the content of the agreement is the city agrees not to change the zoning until all 3 of the phases are built, in exchange for which the developer agrees to build some public improvements. That's actually what a development agreement is everywhere else in the country, at least as far as I can tell. And so the challenge comes if they're being used in place of updating the zoning code. There's an argument, and they're being used to require a developer, in order to get the zoning he wants, to do things that the code doesn't require. He's got a potential argument that those are actually exactions, and that we're imposing and perhaps arbitrarily if we're not doing it across the board, we're imposing conditions on obtaining a zone change that he's otherwise legally entitled to, on doing things that we just think look better or cost more, but aren't public improvements and are not required by the code. And so again, there's, as you mentioned, that hasn't been tested. I don't know that there's a case out there where someone has raised that argument, probably principally because that's not how the agreements are used elsewhere. So there's not a lot of history of developers being able to challenge that particular issue. But going back to the comment that I think Gary made at the beginning, using them to make sure that people build what they say they were going to build is certainly something that is a viable use for development agreements, and it's not suggesting that they should never be used, because they are a tool. It's just a tool that has to be used carefully and doesn't solve not fixing zoning throughout the city.
Great, thank you, Brian. Helpful input and discussion, and I appreciated the natural flow of discussion as well. I don't want to direct necessarily how the discussion goes, but any thoughts? We've heard a little bit from Jamin relative to some of the setback and parking requirements and other things. Other thoughts about this first statement on the agenda here, increasing the Planning Commission's role, to taking a more proactive role in recommending land use policy. Any thoughts, Commission members, on or concerns about doing that?
And I had a question about how that was worded. What was
What statement?
with the Planning Commission increasing a proactive role in developing land use policy? Because I don't know if that's. I'm just
Question
gonna
about.
see, yeah, a question about how that was worded and what.
Well, the discussion, I alluded to this in my opening comments, was sometimes there's been a feeling from planning commissioners that they see something about a development that's not producing either individually or collectively in their mind the outcomes they think should be happening in that location. I think, is it Jamin? A good example, talks about the CVS building on Bulldog, and he's sitting here as planning commissioner and maybe thinking, what a missed opportunity. And maybe there's nothing we can do about this one, but how do I, as a planning commissioner, make sure we don't let the next one happen?
Yeah, like if Provo High sells,
Yeah.
if we decide to sell Provo High, how can we avoid that nightmare that is CVS?
So that's sort of the meaning behind the proactiveness. I think sometimes planning commissioners don't, they just sort of have to feel like they have to take it on the chin. Well, there's another one. And I don't know if there's anything that could actually precludes the planning commission from, at the end of an item, somebody saying, hey, I'd like to make a motion, or I'd like to say, have a little discussion here about what we just approved. And is there a way for us to ask the planning staff to come back with an ordinance that addresses these X, Y, and Z concerns? Just right there. So, just concluding the item and going home, having a little bit of a follow-up motion saying, hey, we're really bothered about X, Y, and Z on this application. Can you come back to us in 6 or 8 weeks with something that would actually prevent these things from happening in the future? And that's what the proactiveness of the planning commission could be potentially. But that may require a little bit of culture or paradigm shift for planning commissioners as they do the job.
And in my mind, I thought it was more communicating that to the council and
Well,
having a
that's how they
discussion.
communicate it to the council.
Right, but through an ordinance change. I don't know. I feel like the council needs to be part of that discussion. I think that would be helpful if there were planning commission members, council members, and planning staff having that conversation as well.
Well, there's, I suppose, and I think, Kim, what you're alluding to is maybe a new system doing things. I think possibly this works in the current system. The current system is the planning commission makes recommendations and they forward those recommendations to the council. And the council can then weigh the merits of that recommendation, approve or just will not approve that change.
So how comfortable is it though, if you're in a meeting and you've just approved something and you're unsettled with something, but are you comfortable in that meeting with the developer just saying, okay, we just approved this, but we really don't like this and this and this about it? Is that a comfortable thing to do,
It's clear anyways,
right?
as we're kind of
As
debating,
you're
like,
discussing it, yeah,
we were really,
okay. And I appreciate the report of action. I always read through those. I always read through all your comments, and so I appreciate the information in there. It's really helpful. The more the better, and I like reading the comments from the neighborhood, and I don't know, I appreciate those reports, because that does influence how I think about something, you know, and it might, you know, get me thinking about something that I hadn't thought about, or I don't know, I just appreciate your comments in those report of action. So, and I'm sure you review those before they come forward, but I just appreciate what you have to say in there and what the neighborhood members and neighbor chair has to say in there too.
We have several comments here. So first Fred, then Kermit, did you have a comment?
I do.
And Ed, and then Gary.
So just building on some of what has been said, we passed a kind of a resolution recently, and the idea, the notion behind it was that there are a number of projects that come to the Planning Commission, and they've been well researched by city staff, and city staff has done due diligence, and they basically have said, under the current law, this project, our recommendation is that it pass, or that we forward a positive recommendation on to the city council based on the snapshot of how the code looks right now. And this resolution that we discussed was to, in many cases, instead of bringing these things to the Planning Commission, let the city staff do their work and let them approve some of them that were not citywide impact, or that seemed like the likelihood was 95 or 99% that it was going to just be a checked off item anyway. That would free up the Planning Commission to the degree that we could actually do some proactive work rather than just reacting in the moment as we get our packet and we study up on those issues that are before us. We feel somewhat handcuffed, I guess, in that moment, because there could have been some things done proactively that would have changed the outcome. But because we only learn about it in this moment, we are really stuck with the way we must vote, in a sense. I mean, and we may personally not be happy with the outcome, but feel obligated. The other frustration is simply that the public, they often show up to a commission hearing and they'll come in mass, and it's sometimes unpredictable. You think this looks like a very quiet issue and it's going to just be a no-brainer, and you walk in and there are 500 people in the room, and there's a lot of discussion about something that plucks at their heartstrings. And they'll come, even sometimes with petitions and other things. They don't really even understand that at this point, the public comment that we're taking is almost a courtesy to them. The way the situation unfolds, even though they may be adamantly or vehemently against something, we are going to approve it based on the way the project's presented and the way the current code is written. So that's frustrating. And so by having city staff approve a lot of these, they just don't even come to, and now we can spend our time, if we don't like the outcome, let's spend it upstream and see if we can't come up with some better solutions. I agree. The development agreements have been very confusing for us as commissioners, trying to say, are we on? Are we using them? Are we not? Sometimes we feel like it's the only tool that we have available to hold them to some standard. I mean, this building on Center Street by Gurus is an example of a disappointment, where we thought we were getting something of a particular quality, and now it's, the money isn't there to make good on that particular quality, but the standards allow for that downgrading or the code allows for that downgrading. So it is what it is. We're stuck with that. So I like the idea of being able to shape that upstream.
Thank you.
It will take a lot of work. I mean, it's going to take work to retool.
It speaks to process and
It does.
other elements. Kermit?
Did you ever redress it?
Well, yeah, I don't want to take your time, just very briefly. I think one of the frustrations would require a public hearing on some of these items. And really the purpose of that public hearing is to say, oh, hey, planning staff, planning commissioners, did you know that this code requirement is not being met, therefore you can't approve it the way it is? But I've ventured in 12 years, Gary, that you've been with planning. Has anybody from the public ever shown up and pointed out a code requirement? No, they think they have very different sense of what that public hearing is all about. Okay, it's and that they're anecdotal or emotional concerns with the project, or even legitimate concerns with the project. I mean, emotional could be
all of it.
I don't want to discount anybody's public comment, wherever it is on the spectrum, but because they're not addressing something of a code requirement, the planning commission really doesn't have much leeway in considering those comments. If they focus their comments on the code, yeah, they could have discussion about that. But I've never seen the public ever understand that's the purpose of these public hearings. And that's something the state requires us to do.
Actually, most of the hearings we have in front of Planning Commission, Provo City Code requires us to do, not state law. State law has very few public hearings that are required in front of the Planning Commission, and those deal with legislative issues. We could, as a city, and that was going to be my comment question, and so at the end, that is one thing I would like to ask the Planning Commission and Council. In light of limited time and resources, do we want Planning Commission focusing more on policy recommendations and for future development to the city, or spending a lot of time in meetings and having hearings on projects that, regardless of their opinion of the project, they have the legal requirement to approve?
That's the frustration.
Did I shade that one way, or did it for you enough?
That's a nod.
spirit of what happened in that meeting to you. And then with respect to development agreements, even if the zoning allows for a certain development, the developer comes in and makes a presentation of what they want to build. And then by the time they get through going through their efforts, even though we've approved it because the zoning allows for it, they can still do a bait and switch without a development agreement. So there's got to be some way for us to say, you said you were going to build this particular type of property, not a funeral home, but the property allowed for a funeral home, and then that's what we end up getting. And so,
I don't want to
yeah,
interrupt
no,
your
that's,
comment.
I'm done.
I had a thought both when Fred was talking and during your comment that the agreements are so confusing. I think it would be, and we talked about this, I think, a couple of years ago, and we talked about it again with Diane Christensen when we had our committee a while back. From my perspective, the most useful thing would be if the Planning Commission didn't worry about whether a development agreement was appropriate or not, but articulated what their concerns were. And what I mean by that is, instead of saying something like, well, we'll vote to approve this, but we think there ought to be a development agreement. We a couple of years ago, we saw several reports of action that said something like that. I would actually rather that the Planning Commission's report of action says, we recommend denial unless concern X, concern Y, and concern Z are somehow fixed, right? And then you send that on to the council. And that does two things. One, it tells the council exactly what your concerns are, so they can make formal findings about whether they share those concerns or not. And two, it signals to the developer, okay, now I know exactly what the concerns are, and if I want to go offer to enter into a contract with the city to address those concerns, I can, and it comes about as an offer from the developer, which solves the exaction issue in many ways, right? And you could even, if you want to be a little bit more positive about it, you could say, we recommend approval, but only if the following concerns are addressed. And one of those concerns could be only if there's an assurance that the project will be built as
Very good.
intended.
How is that different than a development agreement?
Well, that is precisely what in Provo City we have called a development agreement. It's different than what I explained a few minutes ago about what development agreements historically have been. We'll probably continue to call it a development agreement, but it provides us doing it that way provides us with a fundamentally different basis for defending a claim against an exaction. Because instead of them being able to point to a report that says, I'm only going to get my zoning if I enter into this contract that I don't want to enter into, it tells them, I'm only going to get my zoning if I address these concerns. And looking around, it appears to me that one of the ways I can address those concerns is by offering to enter into a contract or development agreement with the city, and then the development agreement is their idea. So it vitiates the voluntariness of the involuntariness of the development agreement.
Brian, if I could just say, I think Brian's advice of a denial is much better. To deny it because you don't want this project. Because at the end of the day, you know, it is the developer's project, and the developer is coming in front of you saying, I want to change in the law to build this because I want to build this. And I think it's very clear and very straightforward and puts the city in a better legal position. If you say, no, we're recommending denial because of these specific reasons. And then it's up to the developer when the developer goes to council to determine whether they want to try and fix those specific reasons. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if the council then looks at that report of action, if you've articulated in that way, you gain some. I mean, say you want the project to happen in the sense that you think there needs to be a development there or something. So you're really hoping that a development will occur, but you don't like the one that's been presented to you. If you articulate it that way, the council can look at the report of action and go, okay, they've told us that they're recommending denial, but they're recommending denial because of X, Y, and Z. So we can feel confident that as long as X, Y, and Z are addressed when it comes to us, we're on the same page as the Planning Commission, and it's okay to approve it.
Would that strategy only work if, in the case of, for example, like they were requesting a zoning rechange, if they're proposing a project that, you know, doesn't require a zoning change, then that strategy doesn't work.
Correct.
Even though we might not like the product that they're proposing, the
Correct.
zoning allows for it,
Yeah, and in that case, I mean, in that case, instance, we're stuck anyway, and the
Yeah.
best we can do is, as Matt has indicated, forward on to the council or the planning staff, your recommendations about what needs to change so that it doesn't happen again.
So that strategy is for legislative items, not administrative
Yeah.
items.
And I would say it's the same issue for the council, right? Because anytime the council approves a rezone, you're changing the law with a new set of requirements and criteria. And every time you do that, you've got to think, what's the minimum that the law allows? That's legally what you can get. And so if you see a project and it's this big highfalutin project, but you say, well, if I change the law, I could get this down here. I'm not willing to vote for a rezone to change the law because I might get this. Then it's up to the developer to determine and proffer to the city, well, I'll guarantee you'll get this. As opposed to the position, as Brian explained, well, we'll grant the rezone, but you have to do X, Y, Z to get it. So I think there's value in saying, no, we don't want this for very specific reasons.
That underscores something I was going to say in response to Fred's comment. When I read that proposal, it seemed to me that it was in some ways a kind of washing of the hands gesture. There's plenty that we're by legal obligation mandated to do in response to these requests that we find distasteful. So we're just going to hand it over to them and let them do it. And I wonder if that's in the city's best interest. Somewhere along the line, someone has to call it and say, this is bad policy. It needs to be changed. And it strikes me that not much time should go by between your having the distasteful experience and something coming our way via the administration that would allow us the chance to weigh the merits of altering the code. Does that make sense?
It's my
It
opinion.
does, but my comment was that it's a little different than that. I'm talking about those that would just simply be rubber stamped anyway.
But
It's my opinion
how do
how-
you carve the difference? That's my question.
It's my opinion, Hal, that I think this approach works either for legislative or administrative. Now, certainly for the administrative items, you're in a position where you have to approve under current ordinances. That I don't think it limits you to say, to follow up with an action somehow, either to request the staff to come back with a proposal that addresses X, Y, and Z, that we can then forward on to the council at a future date. You know, whether that's 2 weeks or 6 months later, depending on the volume of or intensity of the issue and the workload of staff. But again, I think there's some.
The council has an amendment in front of it right now. Bill, what's the one on the double frontage lots on collector roads? And
Yeah, that one was, the city council asked the planning commission, asked the staff, give the planning commission to look at some criteria by which you would evaluate whether a subdivision that fronts a collector road should mandate lots facing that road or not. The amendment that staff proposed that planning commission ratified or recommended and sent to city council was very open and loose. Staff wrote it that way on purpose because we thought we had some good reasons for that, but it was too open and loose for the satisfaction of the council. They felt like some added direction was needed there. We haven't brought that back to you yet. It's one of the things we can talk about tonight or tomorrow night under the planning commission goals that's on the agenda. But that's an example of what Gary's talking about.
where issues come up through the process and planning commission's made a recommendation, it's come to the council, council's looked at it, had some concerns with it, sent it back to planning commission. We'll have a chance to look at it again and send it back.
I guess my point earlier was, is there value in having planning commission at the end of your meeting and you have this discussion and you have some concerns, sending those immediately to the council so that the council can discuss it before staff puts in the hours to do something? Because what if the council doesn't find that is, a priority right then? Or, I don't know. I'm sure if it's a problem for you, it's gonna be a problem for us. But I'm just saying, in the event that, do you put all the staff hours in first and then bring it to the council? Or should the council have a night, have a chance to see, oh, this is a concern, and then relay back to the staff, or, I mean, we can't directly staff. So I don't know.
Well,
I don't know how, but I think there's some, I think it's good to at least give us a heads up that, hey, there's this issue, so it can be discussed before a lot of time and effort and planning goes into.
I think administrative staff, I think planning staff has that ability, that discretionary ability right now, right? In the sense that.
So they can say if they don't want to spend time on it?
Well, in this sense, right? If planning commission says, we really think this part of the code needs to be changed, and council staff says, oh yeah, that's a fantastic idea that's never occurred to us, or we've already been working on that for 6 months anyway, right? Then it's already it's already kind of their baby in that sense, and they'll probably continue to work on it if they think it's a priority. Now, on the other hand, if it's something that Gary says, I've been in a bunch of meetings where the council's talked about that, and I'm not sure they'll agree. He has every ability to come to leadership and say, can we have a work session about this to see whether you want us to put in any more time on it or not?
Okay.
Right. And
so that's already in
so
place.
he's already got the ability to say, I think this might be a waste of time, so I'm going to go ask the council for some direction before I do it.
Okay.
Yeah, addressing these administrative issues, and again, I think this is how I envision it happening. Of course, Gary's over the planning office, and I think his opinion would be valuable if he thinks I'm off base here. But really, I envision the planning commission has the ability to immediately after you make a vote on an administrative item, that one of the planning commissioners could ask the chair or say, Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we ask council staff to address XYZ concerns that came out of this discussion tonight. Could we ask our staff to come back to us in an appropriate time frame to address those issues, and then have a vote just on that motion? Now, you're not making an action. I don't think you have to notice that.
Did you mean to say council staff, or did you mean planning staff?
I'm talking about planning staff.
Okay, you said council, so I just wanted to be
I
clarified.
apologize.
Okay.
I'm different mode.
Okay.
But, I think all of these things that we can do, clearly we can do. I asked that loaded question earlier because I'm going to tell you what we would like to do. And we would like to change the ordinance so that we don't have to take all of these administrative projects where we have no discretion. We're merely a traffic cop. We say yes or no based on the ordinance. Reduce the volume that goes to planning commission so that as we see problems, we'll bring to planning commission. Also, we are trying to structure our planning commission meetings where we have time to have more wide-ranging policy discussions with them. We haven't been able to do a lot of that for various reasons. One not insignificant reason is often our agendas are so full of projects that we have to approve and there is no discussion. We don't have time. We have their attention on a limited basis at a couple of meetings a month. And they serve voluntarily, do a great job in the community. With limited resources and time, I would like to spend working more with them on policy issues, getting to the underlying ordinances and general plans and those things, rather than having an hour-and-a-half meeting when at the end of the day, I can guarantee you, no matter what anybody says from the public in that meeting, they have to legally approve this project.
That's what I was trying to say. Right. I think you said it well.
And Gary's response goes right to Hal's question. I mean, Hal, you asked the question, well, how do you parse which is which, right? And that's exactly the answer, which is you take a look at the Provo City ordinances that impose planning commission duties that the state has not imposed, and you review them to see, are these really things that we want the planning commission to be doing, or do we want staff to be doing these?
For example, a subdivision plat is not required by state code to go to a public hearing. And if you meet all the requirements of that zone, every lot is 10,000 square feet, every lot has 90 feet of frontage, every lot is buildable. There's no discretion there, and staff won't let it go on until they've met all those things. But once they've met all those things, having a public hearing over that, it might be just silly.
That they've got input. We may not always be blessed, though, with the current expertise.
And earlier.
Is there a
you-
message in there for me?
Yes, we may not always be blessed.
That was the nicest firing I've ever had.
Ed, earlier you had a comment. I don't know if it was addressed in this discussion or if you'd like to share something.
I'm a new member of the council, or the commission, and I have two questions for the council. When we make a recommendation to you to approve or deny or whatever, do you ever get the sense, or do we communicate to you that we voted on this with our, holding our nose? That we really didn't like this, but we had to do it because of ordinance? Do you get that impression?
No, not always.
Council members?
Certainly not always.
But often, I think we do, because of the comments, that we do get a list of comments. So that help, that's a big help.
Kind of a summary of the meeting.
Nothing that blunt that says we're voting for that, holding our nose. You know, we don't.
Just put that in there.
Should we do that?
Yeah, put it in there. We're holding our nose.
I mean, should the motion say,
We have
regretfully, we recommend?
I would hope a recommendation from planning commission would never go to the council, because recommendations to the council are our only legislative items. And so policy items, we should never be voting for a policy item reluctantly. It ought to be the policy item that we want to do. Now, administrative items, where the law's already in place and we're judging the project against the law, all the time we hold our nose and give an approval. But on the policy questions, hopefully everybody's saying exactly what they think the policy should be. And it should be, yeah, we support this policy wholeheartedly.
Have you felt like you were holding your nose on policy items where you're recommending to the council?
I think they're more administrative.
Approval? Oh, okay.
Well, both.
Yeah, I would hope that you would recommend denial if you were holding your nose on a recommendation to the council.
How often does the council reverse what we recommend?
It has happened.
Recently. Not too often.
Not real often.
It was
10% of the time.
on the funeral
10
home.
to 15% of the time.
On the funeral home we reversed. But not very often. Like I said, I would really appreciate the comments. I read them all, and it does influence how I think and feel about some of these things, because I appreciate your expertise in that way. So
It adds light and often things we hadn't thought of or considered.
yeah.
But even in addition to the ROA, very often city council members will ask specific questions about the planning commission hearing and what you said, and why you said it. So my impression has been city council's always been very cognizant of the planning commission position.
Who is at the council meetings representing, or who is at the council meetings that can articulate what took place in the commission meeting?
Usually it's the staff member who presented it to you, that's the project manager. But Gary or I, or both of us, are always there to make sure that
So
what's being said is accurate and represents.
And
what
we'll
you
ask
talked about.
questions of the staff,
Yes.
referring back to the discussion of the planning commission.
So does the council ever say, well, how did the commission really feel about this?
In a
Yes,
manner
we
of
have
speaking.
that question.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's fun to watch them win.
I'm gonna have to excuse myself, I have to teach, so sorry to have to leave early. Thank you.
Good luck. Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
So that's why the ROA is important too. If you review those notes, that they say what you feel and think, it's really helpful.
Too bad you don't receive the comments that we, or the discussions that we have out on the steps or out in the.
Yeah, right. And I've only gone to a couple of planning commission meetings. It's, not always easy to make them, but then when there are important things.
Sometimes if we anticipate an item has a higher profile, we'll try to come to the meeting in advance and to try to get the real picture up close in person.
But this has been a good discussion. One thing, as staff, we try to help the planning commission, and we wear different hats because we'll write a staff report that takes a definitive position on a policy recommendation. And sometimes the planning commission follows a recommendation and sometimes they don't. And then the planning commission recommendation goes to council. And so as staff, we're trying to help planning commission, we're trying to help council. Are we not collecting enough or appropriate information in the ROAs? One thing that we haven't done is in our ROAs, send them to all members of the planning commission where they could add individual comment on something that we could include in an ROA. That's just striking me as I'm hearing this conversation as something as staff, we might want to change our procedural approach to this, if that would be helpful to the council and if the planning commission thinks that would be helpful.
Typically just the chair just brings through it and then,
I think that would be helpful, and I think also the fact that we make it a definitive either separate motion or as part of our approval or denial, we elaborate and we capture the essence of all that in the report of action. I think sometimes we condense that down, and I think maybe, and of course, with giving it to all of us, the report of action before it goes to council, that background dialogue that we have after the meeting ends, we would be able to capture some of that conversation and add that to the presentation. I think would be appropriate.
Certainly worth a try. Do you see any merit in the respective chairs meeting occasionally?
That could be helpful. One thing that I would see a lot of merit in is procedurally we have a planning commission recommendation, then it comes to the council for a work meeting, and then it'll go on to a council meeting. And sometimes at work meeting, I've come in with the council and I felt that the meeting hasn't been as productive as it could have been for whatever reason. And then we go to a council meeting and maybe new issues have come up, but a feedback or, hey, we have this concern, can you get this information for us? And I'm feeling like maybe there's a concern that comes up and we haven't had a chance to get the information back to you in a timely manner, or something like that. That maybe those work meetings could be used a lot more to come in and really look at some of the issues.
I had two comments. First of all, I'd be very interested in seeing a proposed ordinance along the lines of what you had suggested. I think it makes sense to free up some of their time on items where they don't really have discretion. And I think developers would appreciate that if we can make that work, because that would just speed the process that much more. Second comment, I was just going to throw out just a possibility. Do you have the discretion to kind of spin off a subcommittee from the planning commission? I'm just kind of brainstorming a couple of council members and 2 or 3 planning commission members kind of working on these more forward-thinking policy issues.
Yes, planning commission could have subcommittees, and one of the things we've been talking a little bit with planning commission and the design review commission is what's the right fit, what's the right role of design review, where does it fit in with planning commission? Should we have a planning commission member work with design review and those types of approaches? I think that fits in nicely with, or that idea with what we've already kind of been doing or starting to do.
Thank you. Well, what have we overlooked? Anything else that you'd like to, other issues or topics you'd like to raise or comment on? It's been a very helpful discussion relative to zoning code, and working together proactively. Kim?
I don't know why this thought keeps coming back to me. I think it was Matt that said something about, was talking about how development in Provo is a little more difficult than other areas. And I just had a comment on Sunday about food trucks, and they were saying that because we have an ordinance and because we do have a more thorough evaluation, that when these food trucks go to the cities, either Orem or Springville, they say, well, if you have a business license in Provo, then we'll just sign you off. And so I don't know if they're benefiting in other ways too, that we're a little more difficult to develop here, and other cities are sort of piggybacking onto that, but I thought that was kind of funny that because we do our business license and because we, the process that they go through here, other cities say, well, if you got one in Provo, then you're good. You're good.
Automatic approval.
This was a vendor that told me that. So anyway.
Food's safer, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
That's in the lead.
I don't know if that translates to development. I thought that was kind of funny.
Well, we thank you very much for your time today and discussion, interaction. It's been healthy and certainly helpful to us. And we appreciate your service and look forward to continuing to work with you. Please let us know. Reach out at any time to any of us. We're happy to have further discussions. So thank you, and we'll adjourn the meeting at this time.
Thank you. Fred, so how long have you been on?
That's kind of
I think, were you there? You were there before I was there.
I had to take a break.
You took a little break?
My wife had some medical issues and I needed to take a break.